Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 4 Reviewed. When you expected that some of the most highly regarded seasons of the show would be good and then they're not, that can leave some questions as to what to expect after that. And just being honest, I have no idea what to expect when it comes to Season 4. As always, the Discord server is linked below, and without further ado, let's get into the reviews. Episode 40A, Miss Dimmsdale. Timmy becomes a judge in the Miss Dimmsdale pageant to stop Vicky from becoming mayor for a day. I can't possibly think of an episode so far that had this much going on at once, and that's not so much a criticism as it is an observation. Some episodes manage to balance everything pretty well, and some of them, this one included, do not. Let me run down the list of plot threads in this episode that all get resolved in the last minute. Vicky leaving Timmy and Catman for dead, all of Vicky's competition getting revenge on her, Timmy's dad winning the pageant, and doing all three phases simultaneously as the only competitor besides Vicky. And also the mayor for a day scene, and etc. And there are even some threads that straight up lead nowhere, such as Cosmo and Wanda. They do absolutely nothing in this episode besides grant Timmy's wish at the beginning. And because all these different threads get meshed together, the part of the episode before the pageant feels like a mess of filler. And I don't think it's helped by how unfunny this episode is. Shockingly so. There were jokes I liked, mainly relating to Timmy's dad, and some of Catman's jokes in the episode were pretty funny, which is actually why I decided to give this episode an okay instead of a good. Now, besides that, this episode is about as funny as watching someone get hit by a bus. A lot of the jokes come off as more awkward than funny, such as the mayor crying after being shown a picture of himself from the 70s. It's jokes like that where I don't even know what the intent was supposed to be. But going back to plot, the main reason besides jokes I decided to give this an okay is because the plot threads are pretty hit and miss. There were the ones I liked and the ones I didn't like, and I can't exactly discount one set for the other. For example, a lot of the stuff revolving around Vicky makes no sense to me. Like, we see that stopping Vicky from winning really makes no difference since Timmy's mom winning would have the exact same result, which is explicitly stated in the episode. They even joke about this in the end when Timmy's dad turns Dinkelberg into essentially a slave when he wins. And to be honest, the whole mayor for a day thing just makes the stakes of the episode incredibly low. I know we're made to believe that they're not, but I don't buy it, as things will basically be back to normal the day after that day. And to add to those low stakes is an incredibly weak wish Timmy makes to be a judge in the pageant. Like, he'll still only end up with a third of the vote, which isn't enough to sway who ends up winning. What the end result of this episode was essentially a Siamese triplet of 3 episodes stitched together with little cohesion to make them seem like a singular entity. And while there were jokes I liked, most of the jokes here were poorly executed. Episode 40B, Mind Over Magic. Timmy wishes to be able to read minds. In all honesty, I find this episode to be really kind of bland. In the story, nothing really happens that you're not expecting to happen. In a weird way, I actually feel like I read the minds of the writers of this episode. It follows the standard Fairly Oddparents formula to a T. Timmy has some kind of problem and makes a wish to solve it. Things go good at first, and then the wish backfires in an unintended way, and then Timmy unwishes the wish and the episode ends. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism, at least in most episodes it's not. In fact, a lot of good episodes follow that formula. But in those that I rated good, there are some good jokes peppered in as well. That's the reason you watch this show, or at least it's the reason I watch this show. And I didn't find this episode to be very funny. There were a few jokes I liked, such as Cosmo's head being used to store things, but other than that and a select few others, this episode did not even come close to making me laugh. Add in how predictable this plot is, and it's another okay episode. Now, it's on the lighter side of okay, unlike the last episode we just looked at, but it still isn't funny enough for me to consider it to be good. In fact, I think just a few more jokes could have made me forget how lifeless an episode can seem. Good enough comedy can absolutely compensate for a lackluster story in my eyes. At least in this show it can. Episode 41, Shelf Life. Timmy travels through various books to get Cosmo's wand back from Tom Sawyer. So the first half of the episode is actually really boring and not much happens. A lot of what it is basically a setup, so while there are jokes there that I find funny, a majority of what happens in this episode happens in the second half, where Timmy, Cosmo, and Wanda are traveling through the books. That's the most amusing part of the episode, and there are a lot of decent jokes in the second half, like Cosmo painting the fence, Ahab's tattoo, and Crocker handing everyone's book reports back to them. Speaking of that last part, the episode is actually pretty cathartic, since we see Chester and AJ being pretty terrible friends to Timmy at the beginning of the episode, and I was actually wondering if that plot thread was ever going to go anywhere. This episode actually feels like a precursor to Channel Chasers, and I'm not going to spoil the rating of that episode, but it honestly feels like the appetizer you watch to get ready for such a long episode about traveling through the various TV shows and channels. But, that said, it does seem to only dip its toe in the water with the various book parodies we see. I would have liked to maybe go a bit deeper, and I'll admit, the weak first half kind of hinders the rest of the episode's ability to go deeper. That said, I'm still going to give this episode a light good, because the second half was just that amusing. Also of note, there are a couple of contradictions to previous episodes in this, such as Cosmo not knowing what the word con means, the season after CosmoCon, and there's also Timmy being able to control a wand, which he couldn't do 2 seasons ago. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. They didn't really bring this episode down, I just thought I'd point them out. Episode 42A, Hard Copy. Timmy gets a copy machine that can turn pictures into real objects. Alright, stop me if you've heard this one before. One, or in this case, both fairies leave, and so Timmy's incompetence leads him to start the apocalypse because he can't be left unsupervised. And yeah, this episode does go in a bit different direction than Wanda's Day Off, but it still borrows enough in concept that I honestly don't see much originality here. When you take away what this episode borrows from Wanda's Day Off, this episode is an empty shell where jokes are supposed to be. The only sort of funny one was when Wanda was cooking bacon, but that was at the very beginning of the episode. And so for the rest of it, you're just waiting for that big laugh that never really happens. It also doesn't really help that the action at the end of the episode isn't as engaging as it could be. It's definitely possible for this show to do that, they have done it before, but in this episode, the climax is weak for what it's trying to be, and that isn't helped by being broken up by jokes that change the tone rapidly back and forth. And if they got a laugh out of me, I might have been able to forgive that, but it's another okay episode. I won't say this episode has nothing good about it, and to be honest, the concept wasn't unsalvageable, I just don't think this episode lives up to its potential. Episode 42B, Parenthoods. Timmy's parents get mistaken for a pair of souvenir bandits. Believe it or not, the criminals that look identical to a mainstay character of the show causing those characters to get framed for their crimes is actually a pretty common cliche. We've seen it in a number of shows, and to be fair, this isn't some kind of revolutionary take on that either. The plot here is actually pretty basic when some of the moving parts are stripped away, but this is actually a good example of just how much mileage you can get out of jokes, because I consider this to be a good episode. There are a few running gags in this episode, like Cosmo being an expert about Canada for some reason, mustaches, and the turn bombs have some decent one-liners as well. I'm not going to say there weren't jokes I didn't like. A lot of the Canadian stereotypes were so level 1, I didn't really find them offensive, they were just kind of basic and overdone. But I gotta hand it to them. The jokes they did tell were actually funny enough to make me enjoy a kind of bland plot. And bland plots are kind of becoming the most common criticism so far this season. In pretty much each of the episodes so far, just a few jokes I liked could have gone a long way. Case in point, this episode. Episode 43A, Lights, Camera, Adam. Timmy auditions for a part in a Crimson Chin movie. Okay, so there are a few inconsistencies here just on the base premise level. For starters, this is Adam West's second appearance this season, and in the first one, he plays a completely different superhero character. Like, if you were going to give West his own episode, I think that should have been planned out a little better, or explained, or you should have even just joked about it. At the very least, I thought it was something that should have been acknowledged. Secondly, if you're going to have characters that are actually real people that exist, you cannot have subtle parodies of obviously real people in the same episode. For example, Adam West and Jay Leno play as themselves in this episode, but then you have Britney, who is obviously based on Britney Spears. And piggybacking off that, the Crimson Chin has been played by Jay Leno in every appearance so far. You cannot have him be played by Adam West in this one episode, especially if you put Jay Leno in that episode. But nitpicks aside, I actually think this episode is good. The amount and quality of jokes in this episode really do make up for its flaws. For example, while Adam West's entire role in this episode is confusing in a meta sense, in the episode I actually find his jokes to be really funny. If you've seen him in Family Guy, he's basically the same character as he is in the Fairly Oddparents. But that's not necessarily a criticism, as they have clearly built a mold that works. Cosmo also has some decent one-liners in this episode as well, such as the one about Wanda being a trophy wife, and the one about Hollywood being fake, which was in response to the quote I put on this slide. I also like the ending scene where the Chin fights the bronze kneecap. It's pretty cinematic, and overall, decent given the animation quality of the show. And if the episode didn't have the meta problems surrounding it, it would probably go toe-to-toe with some of the best from seasons 1 to 3. Episode 43B, A Bad Case of Diary Timmy uses secrets from Vicky's stolen diary against her. With the other episodes this season, I started my reviews out by listing my complaints. So, this time, let's start out by talking about what I liked about this episode. Okay, now that that's over with, I can start listing the negatives, which are definitely plentiful with this one. It's a
bad episode.
First off, the easy stuff. The ethics of this episode are once again with the wrong character. We saw a lot of this with Vicky in the episodes in seasons 2 and 3. Having Timmy be the one that learns from the situation in an episode where Vicky objectively does something worse and doesn't develop at all is continually insulting, and it only sours the more times they do this. Secondly, in this episode, the writers seem very confused about how they want to portray Wanda. The catalyst for her basically wanting to murder Vicky is that she called a pink squirrel fat, which is implied to be Wanda. And they keep reusing that same joke that wasn't funny as catalyst for other plot points. In this episode, Wanda is just this black hole that sucks up any possible comedy to be had around her. And even if the joke was funny to begin with, reusing it as many times as they did will get old to the point that it would just wear off anyway. Also, Vicky's crush, aside from being a giant stereotype, is just so poorly executed even if a giant stereotype was what they were going for. He's supposed to be British, and the voice actor barely attempts to do a British accent. If you just heard clips of that voice, you would not be able to tell he was doing a British accent. Either get a real British person or be a better director. So yeah, poor execution of an idea that was kinda doomed anyway. Episode 44A, Babyface. Timmy becomes a baby. Gosh, what do I say about this one? Oh yeah, this is one of those episodes where Timmy just can't catch a break. At the end, it looks like he wins, but no, instead Timmy goes right back to being tortured, and neither his parents nor Cosmo and Wanda seem to want to do anything about it. But sure, even if this episode's ending was fixed, there's way too many problems here for me to give it a good. For example, the conflict itself. The conflict in this episode is so level 1. Timmy has to find a way to unwish his wish. Like, at first you think the Francis stuff was going to be the bulk of the conflict, but no, instead it only sets up the flimsy one we get. And as a result, the midsection of this episode is really boring. And, oh yeah, Timmy gets put in a cage surrounded by laser beams as a baby in this episode. And then he gets put in another cage at the end. I don't understand a lot of times why child neglect is used as a joke in this show, but child abuse is on a whole nother level. But, oh, don't worry, they get their neglect in this episode too. Timmy's parents decide to leave him at a daycare where they apparently abuse children and is seen as more like a prison than anything else. The only way this episode has a prayer of even being okay is if the jokes are funny. And boy oh boy, this episode has some of the worst excuses for jokes in this show I've seen so far. It's not like most other unfunny episodes where there just aren't that many jokes. In this episode, the jokes were bothersome in how hard they were trying but still falling short. Timmy vomits on Francis, which is just disgusting, and the ending climax is the absolute worst place to put a meta joke, or at least it is if the meta joke isn't funny. Timmy's parents stop and stare at a door, just to drag out the climax.
It's a bad episode.
And probably worse than anything from Season 3. Episode 44B, Mr.Right. Timmy wishes for everything he says to be right. I've been going back and forth about how I feel about this episode for a while, and I haven't been able to reach a conclusion for some time. And I think it's because of how this episode's premise really works against it. In this episode, Timmy wishes for something that in any other episode would be against the rules, and should be against the rules. Because what they've done here is given Timmy a cheat code to circumvent the rules, which are a crucial part of the show, and the Fairly Oddparents would not work as a concept without them. All Timmy has to do is say that he has something that's against the rules, or say that a certain rule doesn't exist anymore, and because he's right all the time, he's effectively created a way to bypass the rules. Now, does that happen in this episode? No, but this is why you have to think your stories through. The implications you create will be there for your audience whether you intend them or not, especially if you don't address them in an episode like this. And the more I think about it, the episode fails in such a fundamental way that, yeah, I'm gonna call it a bad episode. When there's something wrong with the wish, which is the fundamental thing episodes of this show are built around, I don't really care what the rest of the episode has in store. That may seem a bit harsh, but on the flip side, there have been episodes that use a deconstruction of their implications and do great things with them. And there are more upcoming this season, so there's really no excuse to drop the ball like this episode did. Episode 45A, Vicky loses her Icky. A bug that gave Vicky her meanness stops infesting her, thus making her nice. This is another case of an episode where I don't really love the plot all that much. It's a bit simple, and while sure, simple can work, Timmy chasing a bug around is something that you have to really put effort into to make it work, or just make it really funny. And there's also another angle that I think this plot is kind of weak on. Vicky becomes nice, but you know the episode is going back to the status quo at the end, so it's all kind of meaningless. I'm not really expecting much suspense out of a show like The Fairly Oddparents, but when I already know how the episode will end after 2 minutes, it almost defeats the purpose of watching the episode. The good news is, this episode had a lot of one-liners I really liked. There's the quote I put on the slide, but also, the highlight manages to turn into a running gag that doesn't overstay its welcome, and it also really seems to work just due to how vague it is. I also found it pretty funny how Cosmo just blows up Pluto at the end. And considering how this episode came out before it stopped being considered a planet, that's just a whole new layer of unintended humor. I also like how Timmy's parents just sit in their car and wait to get hungry before they decide to go eat at the Cake and Bacon. It seems like this episode can do stupid humor pretty well without completely dumbing the jokes down. So, with the really good jokes combined with the sort of weak plot, I'm going to give this episode a light good. If you're less forgiving of weak plots, you might think this is okay or bad, but I think this is too funny not to be considered good. Episode 45B, Pixies Inc. Corporate fairies called Pixies acquire Fairy World in a hostile takeover. And here we have another episode with no suspense. Although, this time, I think there's not enough good jokes to save it. I mean, first, let's think about what the Pixies are at a conceptual level. They're corporate fairies whose design is to be as boring as possible, and they're voiced by Ben Stein, who is directed to be as monotone as possible. And the Pixies being as boring as they are is supposed to be the joke, but shocker, it comes off as more boring than funny. And when you have a plot when you know what's going to happen, you can't afford to have that. Everyone on planet Earth knows Timmy isn't going to lose Cosmo and Wanda, and that some contrivance will force him to win the golf match. That's not why anyone watches The Fairly Oddparents, though. People watch The Fairly Oddparents because they're expecting it to be funny, and when it isn't, you have to be able to fall back on a story that's engaging. This one is not. The stakes are incredibly low because if Timmy loses this golf match, he loses Cosmo and Wanda, thus defeating the point of the show. Because of this, I know Timmy won't lose the golf match, thus defeating the point of this specific episode of the show. Now, is it the worst thing ever? No, and I really don't want it to sound like that's what I'm saying. There's no real gross or offensive stuff here, and there's no mind-numbingly stupid stuff here either, but there isn't anything good here either. I have to give it an okay. Episode 46A, The Odd Couple. Vicky gets a boyfriend who only doubles the amount of abuse Timmy receives. This episode is one I didn't like on the first watch through, but the more I watched, the more I liked the episode. I think part of the reason why is that I didn't notice many of the clever moments in the episode. It's actually more quietly funny than others. Some of Cosmo's one-liners are pretty funny, and the ending gag where Ricky ends up becoming Crocker's stepdad is one of the funniest ways I've seen an episode end so far. I think that when you give some sort of setup to the abuse Timmy receives, sometimes it's good to have him just try to get out of it and have a plot that consists of just that. As much as I did like the jokes in this episode, they did seem to have a lower success rate than other episodes. Like, sure, an episode can have one joke, and if it's successful, 100% of the jokes were funny, but sometimes episodes that tell a lot of jokes tend to have some duds in there as well. The latter is still usually funnier than the former, so I'm not trying to take away from that, but yeah, jokes like the torpedo at the beginning of the episode, or Cosmo pointing out the large number of rich women were cringy at best. I also think I should talk a bit about the story flaws here. They weren't as numerous, and they didn't hinder the episode that much, but they were still there, and warrant a mention. This episode can feel like a series of montages at times, and that's even by the episode's own admission. I don't really mind that, but there are very few things that make me feel like this story was tied together very cohesively, and I guess you could say the jokes make up for that, but it's still a problem. I'm gonna give this episode a light good. Episode 46B, Class Clown. Timmy learns that the secret to winning the heart of Trixie Tang is being funny. My favorite part of the episode was how the plant keeps being referred to as seemingly harmless. That was actually a running gag that didn't wear out its welcome, which, when you get down to it, makes this episode kind of puzzling. Not that I'm complaining, but this episode is really funny, but it's not because of Timmy. Almost all the jokes in this episode that work are because of Cosmo. I think it might have made more sense to have Timmy say some actually clever stuff when he becomes the funniest guy on Earth instead of having everyone laugh at anything he says no matter what it is, because I think the audience could have gotten more out of it that way. That said, I'll take what I can get, and I have to say, I laughed a lot at this episode. The ending gag was really funny, as well as Jorgen making fun of Timmy at the comedy club, if for no other reason than how awkward that whole scene is. I also really do like the climax of this episode. Timmy becomes unfunny again and only saves Trixie's life out of his own morality, as he knows she's probably not going to want to date him. That shows great character development on the side of Timmy, and it's not too dissimilar to the ending of A Wish Too Far from Season 1. But I honestly have to say, it was done a lot better in this episode, and to me, is an underrated example of how a story in this show can be really good. And for that reason, it's a good episode. Episode 47, The Big Superhero Wish. Real life turns into a comic book with superheroes and supervillains. So, for the specials this season, so far we're 2 for 2 on having Timmy travel into books being the concept. Obviously that's not going to affect this episode much though, as it obviously goes in a different direction. I just thought I'd point it out. This episode has some clear problems that keep it from being as good as it could be though. There does seem to be a lot of filler at the beginning just to get this episode to 22 minutes, and I honestly think it could be cut down to 11 with only a few edits. There's just a good chunk of time in this episode right after Timmy makes his wish where it's just characters saying, "My name is so-and-so and this is my power." There had to be a different way to get that exposition in, because that scene lasts a few minutes, and it wasn't very substantive, especially when they use it to introduce characters that don't get much screen time. I also thought the moral in this episode, yes, this episode has a moral lesson, was not only forced, but really unnecessary. Yes, ordinary people can be heroes to some people, we get it. You know, that message kinda loses its luster when those same characters completely ignore Timmy getting harmed in succession at the beginning of the episode. I also thought the continuity backstory at the beginning was kinda dumb. They bring up Crimson Chin meets Mighty Mom and Dino Dad, which I don't need to remind you was an awful episode. Yeah, they bring that episode up at the beginning, and also reuse animation, and then they do nothing else with it, which is probably another minute that could have been shaved off this episode. As many complaints as I had, I also really liked the episode. The overall style is really explored well, and I think this is the first Crimson Chin episode to really go all in with the comic angle. And I have to say, it works. And it works a lot better than in Crime Wave because we actually see why everything's like a comic book, and there's not so much ambiguity. The characters, while introduced horribly, also tend to be really well designed, and there are some pretty obvious nods to real superheroes and villains, such as Dr. Croctopus, which is clearly modeled after Doc Ock, and Wonder Gal being inspired by Wonder Woman. I also really like the jokes here. Jokes like Cosmo saying, "I mean meow," when he's in the form of a cat, and the ending gag with Patton Oswalt, which I'm not even going to spoil. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. And yes, that quote "in context" is pretty funny, and has even become a meme because people think he's saying something there that he clearly isn't. That's part of why I made it the quote, by the way. Because the fact that people think they'd allow a word that offensive and controversial in a kid's show is so stupid, and I think this is hopefully where that misconception will come to die. Moving on from that tangent though, I think this episode redeems enough of its flaws to be considered good, but I don't know if I'd argue with you that much if you thought it was okay. Episode 48A, Power Pals. So here is the second episode in a row about superheroes, and it really feels like 3 because the last one was twice as long as a regular episode. This one, I don't think has as much upside as the last one. I mean, let's really think about this. Timmy is awful to his friends, so he wishes for these superhero friends. Then they treat him like garbage, and so his friends automatically forgive him and send the superheroes to another galaxy. Even in a show about magic, that's really hard for me to buy. How fast Timmy's friends forgive him is really not believable, and especially given the dumb things Timmy did to them, I'm not so sure I'd forgive him in that situation. Another problem I have with the episode are these superheroes themselves. While some of the transformations in the last episode were pretty cliched, at least you could say they were inspired. In this episode, we get straight up knockoffs of the Justice League. So much though, that I've mentally forgotten what they were even called after multiple watch-throughs and refer to them by the name of their Justice League counterparts. That's pretty bad. But this episode as a whole isn't. I actually think the running gag of Aquaman wanting to fight things close to water was just funny enough to pull this into the lower side of okay. And yes, I'm calling him Aquaman, because in the show I don't remember what he's called, and it's Aquaman. I don't care what stupid name they gave him, they were clearly making an Aquaman-esque portrayal. Episode 48B, Emotion Commotion. Timmy becomes emotionless. Fun fact, Francis's proportions are off in the first scene, which for a show with as geometric a style as the Fairly OddParents you'd think wouldn't happen. Anyway, this episode is one I could easily see someone thinking of as boring when viewed in a vacuum. Timmy's voice becomes real monotone and he honestly becomes an observer to things that happen around him. But I actually think that's the episode's greatest strength. Just based on concept, going in, I wasn't expecting the flashiest episode, so I'm not too underwhelmed with the product I ended up with getting. In a lot of ways, it actually exceeded my expectations. The jokes in this episode are more peppered in than they are jam-packed, so it's just a matter of the margin they build over the course of the episode. Crocker trying to get a reaction out of Timmy was pretty funny, as was Chester and Trixie's relationship, in air quotes. But what really makes this episode for me is the story. It's really cathartic to see Timmy's enemies get their just desserts after so many confusing narratives and mixed messages in seasons 2 and 3. Maybe it's not fair to judge things that way, but I really see the plot of this episode as the writers learning from past mistakes. I know I may be biased, and if this episode came out in season 1, I might have a less favorable view of it, but as is, I'm going to call it good. I'd also like to point out that this show did an Inside Out style portrayal of emotions before Inside Out. Not necessarily good or bad, I'm just pointing it out. Episode 49A, Fairy Friends and Neighbors. Cosmo and Wanda become the Turners' neighbors. This is certainly an interesting episode. Normally I see Timmy getting neglected and it's treated as his fault or there's some moral qualm I have with the episode. This show has shown us time and time again that it fails to see Timmy being neglected as funny. And I bring that up only because this is one of the rare times that it actually is. Don't get me wrong, this episode does have some questionable problems regarding Timmy's treatment, like some of the stuff Vicky does in this episode seems out of character even for her, including strapping Timmy to what is essentially a torture table. Yeah, Vicky is an evil character, but this isn't Saw last time I checked. But as far as Timmy's parents go, I'd say this is a big step in their character development. A lot of the time when they neglect Timmy, it's either seen as his fault or his problem to deal with. In this episode, that's not the case, and we actually end up getting some good jokes out of it. That whole scene with Timmy's parents and Cosmo and Wanda at the fancy restaurant is one of the funniest of the show so far, and the setup to that is that Timmy's parents feel guilty about what they've done. That may not seem like a lot, but there is more than just story purposes that are helped by that. It can actually make things a lot funnier because Timmy's parents being obnoxious on purpose is the kind of thing that I think their characters were designed for. It's why Timmy's parents were funny in the first place, and why this episode's good. Episode 49B, Just the Two of Us. I'm having a really hard time remembering a time I was this uncomfortable after watching a Fairly OddParents episode. Maybe the Switch Glitch or Snowbound could tie this episode, but I don't know which of the three could take the cake, and I'm not about to rewatch those episodes to find out. The way this episode makes its characters look is just incredibly awful for no reason. At this point in the show, there have been enough episodes that show Trixie's personality is too awful for Timmy to still have a crush on her, and that Timmy's reasons for still liking Trixie are shallow and stupid. But even if you want to throw continuity out the window, within this episode, Trixie goes above and beyond being attention-obsessed and goes over the line to potentially narcissistic personality disorder. That's not me taking a kid's show too seriously. That's the way she's written. She's like a crack addict, except one who gets high off the attention she gets. And unfortunately, I've been around people like this, and they're not very pleasant to be around. But society tends to excuse that kind of person's flaws just because they're attractive. According to the writers of Ed, Edd and Eddy, they scrapped an episode called Special Ed because they said it was too real. Those two words are exactly how I describe this episode. Trixie isn't an exaggerated personality here. If someone like this in real life was left alone with one person, this is exactly how they'd act, and it's not funny. It's a
Bad episode.
Episode 50A, Who's Your Daddy? Timmy needs a dad to take to the father-son event at the Squirrely Scout camp. So, as you can tell by the quote, this episode makes jokes about the Squirrely Scouts and nuts, which, come on, they know what they're doing. You can't tell me lines like that weren't intentional. To be fair, the fact that they got away with that is kind of impressive considering that Wanda says eliminate instead of kill only a few episodes ago. They can have AJ's dad say he loves big nuts, but they aren't allowed to say kill because logic, I guess. Anyway, about the episode, this is one of the most flawed good episodes I've ever seen. Yeah, I do have a few gripes, but they were honestly small. Let's start with the fact that Timmy's dad is just awful for really no reason. Like, he leaves his own son and flies around in a flying squirrel costume. It's kind of dumb. I also think the foreshadowing's pretty weak. They make it pretty obvious that Timmy's substitute dad is going to be his mom, which also kind of weakens the plot in a way, because all the other dads Timmy has are kind of for no reason. And Timmy's mom is kind of a survival expert for no reason, except it's convenient for the story. That said, I gave this episode a good rating for a reason, and that was because of Cosmo's flashbacks. They're really self-contained, so I don't mind the implications that come with them. Seriously, if you haven't seen the episode, go watch it just so you can see the flashbacks. Also, some of the jokes with Sanjay's dad were pretty funny too, and they were probably the funniest of the three dads. The scene with Chester's dad was funny, but not super hilarious, and the scene with AJ's dad wasn't funny at all. But I do like most of the jokes they tell in this episode. It's not going to make any top 5 lists, but the jokes do place over the line. Episode 50B, Homewrecker. Timmy gets back at Vicky by wrecking her house. This was an episode that started out boring and ended as confusing. And by that I mean the first half or so is really just set up for the rest of the episode. That's a long time to wind up the plot, and as a result it doesn't have much time to play out. The first part of the episode is just Vicky trashing Timmy's house. Then Timmy trashing Vicky's house. It gets old, kind of like most of the jokes here, such as the kilt running gag and Cosmo constantly saying, "Or do I?" after everything. Honestly, they wear out their welcome pretty quickly. At least they try to tell jokes in this episode though, which is more than can be said for a lot of okay and bad episodes in this season. I just happen to not find the jokes they told to be that funny, which will happen every once in a while. And I could see someone with different tastes really liking this episode. I don't want to be too harsh though, because I do like a lot about this episode too. The fact that Vicky doesn't win in the end is something to be celebrated, and the fact that everything bad isn't automatically blamed on Timmy in the end was nice to see, and we see him actually end up in the good graces of his parents, which is distressingly uncommon for this show. With all the good and bad here, this episode rounds out to an okay. Episode 51A, New Squid in Town. Mark flees his home planet to avoid marrying someone he doesn't love. Fun fact, this episode has 2 titles. Sometimes it's referred to as New Squid in Town, and sometimes it's referred to as A New Squid in Town. Anyway, so this is the first episode with Mark Chang where the title doesn't follow some tired naming convention, and it's honestly the first one that doesn't follow a tired and stupid idea. I don't know why they thought Spaced Out was so great it needed to be done 3 times, but needless to say, the okay ratings that all of them got, it was a stale idea to begin with. So does that mean Mark is a redeemed character now that they decided to break the mold? Kind of. I certainly appreciate that they broke the mold, and it's nice to see Vicky wasn't even in this episode, but honestly, I found this episode to be boring. Besides the highlight, the only other joke that was good was when they unfreeze Crocker. But even that one is used too much to the point that it gets stale. The plot itself is one of the most basic and linear plots this show has spat out, which normally wouldn't be a problem if the jokes were there to compensate, but they're not. So what you end up with is a really dull experience overall. It's kind of a shame Mark has been this underused relative to potential, because he's not a bad character, and the concept of Yuccopotamia is not doomed from the very beginning. But when I watch episodes with Mark in them, the only thing I feel is disappointment. This episode is no different than the others. Add another okay episode to the pile. Episode 51B, Wish Fixers. Timmy enters a contract with the Pixies to stop making bad wishes. I don't know what to say. This episode has actually left me speechless, and not in a sense of being shocked, but more so the fact that I'm speechless because this episode gives me nothing interesting to talk about. With as little potential as the first Pixies episode had, I'm honestly shocked that they revisited those characters so soon. I get that the point of the Pixies is that they're supposed to be funny and how boring they are, but as I've said, that's a very difficult balance to strike, and the Pixies just come off as more boring than funny. And in this episode, the entire pace of the plot is driven by these Pixies. It's like they suck the life out of any episode they're in. It's as if writers think they don't need to add any more jokes because the Pixies are funny enough on their own. There is one joke they use besides expecting you to laugh at corporate jokes that aren't funny, and that joke is Cosmo shouting. Yeah, they have Cosmo shout a lot in this episode, which isn't funny, and all it does is annoy me. I guess you could say it's good that one thing made me actually feel an emotion, but honestly, I can't be too mad at the rest of the episode. While there isn't much that's maddening, there's not anything I can say I enjoyed about the episode either. It's just dull and boring, and I wanted it to be over. Okay episode. Episode 52A, Truth or Cosmoquences. If you've seen Shell of a Man from SpongeBob, you've seen this kind of episode before. Although, I'm not going to go as far to say this episode ripped off Shell of a Man, because not only is it fair to hold shows accountable for ideas that have been done by others, but also, this episode actually came out 3 months earlier, so that wouldn't even be accurate. The way I describe this episode is really difficult to translate into a rating, but I'll do my best. Serviceable might be the best way to explain it. The plot gets you from point A to point B and has some character development in it, as Cosmo does learn the admittedly overused lesson of be yourself, which is kind of a level 1 lesson, but it works. There are also enough jokes to keep you amused along the way, such as Brittany being hypnotized, and some of Cosmo's lies were funny. There's even a subplot which adds a bit of complexity to the story. The subplot isn't super great. It essentially boils down to Timmy has to go to the bathroom, which isn't as good as it could have been, but it keeps this episode from being boring. I guess if I had a problem with the episode, it would be that Cosmo tries to get them to believe he's rich, which, as I've brought up before, money should mean nothing to fairies who can poof anything they want into existence. It's really inconsistent with the way this show's magic system works, which is honestly kind of sad that they're having inconsistencies this early on in the show. That one thing didn't hinder my enjoyment though. I still think it's a good episode, and it does enough to get by and not be considered okay. Episode 52B, Beach Bummed. By wishing to be the strongest person on the beach, Timmy tries to thwart Francis's bullying attempts. This is really a zany episode. In fact, it was tough for me to piece together the plot in order to give this a proper synopsis. Sure, Timmy does try to thwart Francis's attempts to bully him, but that's only really the beginning. This episode has a winding plot that's moving a lot but doesn't really go anywhere at the same time. And while that would usually be a criticism, with this episode it really isn't. I was still constantly invested in what happened in every term, and I should be. And the fact that there is a lot going on means this episode has a lot more substance to go along with the comedy than most episodes this season, where we've usually only gotten one or the other. I really like the loophole where Timmy magically becomes stronger because a whale washes up on the beach, for instance, which is more clever than a lot of episodes would be given the circumstances, as this very easily could have been a case of style over substance. Cosmo also gets a few moments to shine as well, such as when he pushes that crab to the side in the fish tank, and when he pinches Bickle's nose. Elvis Presley is a character in this episode for some reason, which I'm not even going to question because it got a couple laughs out of me. The lifeguards are also pretty funny, as they're generally slow and unhelpful, but they're self-aware of that, so they end up being pretty funny. I have to say, so far this season, this episode has the most individual aspects I liked. I'm emphatically giving this episode a good. Episode 53 through 55, Channel Chasers. Timmy is tired of never being believed by his parents, and so he decides to live the rest of his life in the TV. As far as Fairly OddParents episodes go, it quite literally does not get more iconic than this. A lot of people also tend to think this episode is where the show ended, and depending on what I end up thinking of the seasons after this, I'm not sure I wouldn't disagree. The genius behind this episode lies in its seamless ability to progress the story while at the same time getting in a bunch of TV parodies. And it never feels like they're trying to do one or the other, or that they're trying to do one in spite of the other. And there are still a decent amount of them, including but not limited to Flintstones, Tom and Jerry, The Jetsons, Johnny Quest, Batman the Animated Series, Rugrats, Sesame Street, and quite a few more that I didn't mention. And the main overarching one is a show called Maho Mushi, which makes fun of a bunch of different things at once, like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Dragon Ball, and even Star Wars, surprisingly. Even just comedically, there's a lot of good material here. And Maho Mushi is actually where the meat of the climax takes place, and we get a pretty interesting fight scene between Timmy and Vicky. It definitely seems like the team that wrote this episode did their homework and actually knew about and were fans of the things they parodied, which probably shouldn't be a big ask, but it is sadly. A lot of parodies seem to not have any kind of respect for the original property. I was really impressed with them here though, and how they managed to integrate them into the story. I also really like the way this episode ends. Timmy gets the satisfaction he needs and reverts things back to normal, which is a pretty clever way to not have all the point be sucked out of the show, while still giving some satisfaction to the viewer, which might be a point against how this episode should have been the last one. This episode is good by a country mile, and dare I say, my favorite one so far. Episode 56A, Catman Meets the Crimson Chin. I didn't put a synopsis because the title basically is a synopsis, but I really wish I felt something about this episode. Like, this is the most bare-bones predictable episode in quite a while, which actually says a lot when you consider there being quite a few in Season 4. But this is on a whole nother level of boring. There are no jokes. At all. And there's a lot of awkward dialogue where you think there'd be jokes, but no writer fills in the space with anything funny. There ends up being a few conflicts with this one, but they're like cracks in the road where someone immediately fills them with cement once they're found. There's practically nothing. It's like if you had a skeleton of a Fairly OddParents episode. As soon as a plot point comes up, you know exactly what's going to happen. And the climax of the episode is Timmy guessing the password to Catman's computer, which, surprise, surprise, Timmy guesses it on his first try. I guess the fight scene that led up to that was kind of interesting, but it's not anything I'd write home about. This was really disappointing for an episode with this title, but I'm gonna give it an okay for one reason. There's not anything bad in it. My philosophy is that something has to subtract from the watching experience to be considered bad, and with this, it's like asking what the taste of air is like. It just tastes like nothing, but is it bad? No, I don't think so. Just isn't good either. Episode 56B, Genie, Meanie, Minie, Mo, Timmy meets Norm the Genie. Wish Fixers was like 4 episodes ago, right? Well, this is actually a better version of that episode in every way. And yeah, I didn't give that one a bad, but it came close. Like a lot of episodes this season, Wish Fixers was jokeless and substanceless, so when you add some color, flavor, and, oh yeah, Norm Macdonald, the episode becomes a lot better. I mean, first off, the entire premise of the episode leads up to Timmy learning he should make better wishes. And what's even better is that Norm ends up getting the punishment by the end of the episode. It really does seem like they were trying to atone by doing a better version of Wish Fixers. The concept of Norm is also something I wanted to touch on. This is Norm's first appearance, and the episode does a nice job of giving us the exposition of what genies are without outwardly stating too much. I'm fine with heavy exposition episodes, even in a show's 4th season, but this episode, and really the entire show, does it better than most shows. In other shows, the dialogue explaining things might come off as a bit forced, but I think it works here because at this point we've seen anti-fairies, pixies, and the holiday mascots way back in Season 1. I think it's safe to say we know there's going to be some kind of twist whenever some new magical creature comes up. I also like the jokes here. Crocker seems to be especially funny, and that's made even better by the fact that they come up with jokes for him that don't involve him being cruel to his students. Norm himself has some interesting sarcastic personality, and he has a few quips that made me laugh. There were some dud jokes in there, such as a pedophilia joke I'm not even going to get into. In fact, it's like something you'd see on Family Guy, and that old man named Timmy Turner might as well be a ripoff of Herbert the Pervert, but other than one joke I didn't like, this episode checks all the boxes. It's good. Episode 57 and 58, School's Out the Musical. The Pixies use Flappy Bob in an elaborate 37-year plan to take over the world. And here's the most interesting episode to talk about this season. I mean, for starters, there's no real overarching problems with this one that distract from the main point. This episode actually has some energy behind it, which seems to be something that very few episodes this season can actually say. There's twists and turns in the story, and we get to see it from multiple characters' perspectives. For example, Cosmo and Wanda get a really heart-wrenching song together, and while the way their song is used to move the plot may be contrived, it's made into a joke, and it sort of makes sense given Jorgen's general incompetence at times. Something important to note is that while channel chasers use TV parodies to move the plot forward, this episode uses songs, and so the episode lives and dies based on its songs. And so, with this episode, I think it goes without saying that the songs are amazing. Seriously, I listen to some of these on their own detached from the episode, they're just that good. They have their own charm and it really doesn't sound like anyone's inexperienced or bad at singing, which could have really derailed an episode like this. The plot itself is one that makes sense for the Fairly Oddparents, which, if you just want to write that off and say that I'm being a bit too fundamental with that observation, just remember, there are plenty of plots that have made sense for the show that bombed horribly. This did not, and that's something to be celebrated. Things were constantly moving, nothing was predictable, and they actually made a good use of the Pixies. In their only 2 appearances this season other than this one, their episodes were okay. They actually figured out how to use them as an antagonist and not make the episode completely boring. Maybe it was because of the bipolar nature of Flappy Bob that balances it out, or maybe because they actually give them a decent song and some decent jokes, but I actually thought the Pixies were finally in a good episode. So, as for a rating, I'm gonna give this episode a good. You'll find out in my top 5 whether I thought this or Channel Chasers was better, but either way, I plan on comparing the two in their own video more in depth, so you'll find out why I picked the one I did. And that is every episode of Season 4 reviewed. Let's look at the chart. And so here it is. 15 goods, 9 okays, and 4 bads. Sure, the quantity of goods this season is higher than any season since 1, but looking back, a lot of those were just barely good enough to get the good rating. In terms of quality, the goods in Season 3 were a lot better despite their rarity. Season 4 does seem to be quite a bit of an improvement in terms of bad episodes though, having the fewest since Season 1. But imagine if Season 1 didn't only have 13 episodes. Yeah, the statistics would be less skewed, I think. So then that begs the question, what wins out in this case? Quantity or quality? I went back and forth with myself many times, but I decided that the quantity of good episodes still manages to win out. they do make up a majority of the season after all. So, with that said, Season 4 is finally another good season. Though, if I had to rank the seasons, 1 would still be ahead of 4. For those asking where the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour is, it's technically not a part of a season, so I will be reviewing all 3 of those separately in their own video, and the top and bottom 5 will get their own video as well. But to conclude, while this may have been bland at parts, this season overall was still an enjoyable watching experience, and probably the best season since 1. Who knows what the future holds with Season 5. As always, thanks to Pie Guy Rules for the inspiration, and thanks Fairly Oddparents Wiki for the information to make this video. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.